Senator Mitchell's skills as a diplomat are perhaps most widely understood and acclaimed through his work as Special Advisor on Ireland to President Bill Clinton. Under his untiring leadership, the governments of the Republic of Ireland and the United Kingdom and the political leadership of Northern Ireland forged the Good Friday Agreement in April of 1998, a historic achievement that ended many decades of deadly conflict in Ireland. From the perspective of the MENA region, Senator Mitchell's most notable accomplishments are likewise those of a peacemaker. He has served as President Barack Obama's Special Envoy for Middle East Peace, as well as chairman of an international fact-finding committee on violence in the Middle East. Prior to these accomplishments, Mr. Mitchell enjoyed a very successful career. Now, earlier in my career, I taught history at Bowdoin College, Senator Mitchell's alma mater in the United States, in the town of Brunswick, Maine. In addition to my teaching responsibilities, I served as the campus planner. And as such, I was responsible for helping to plan new academic buildings. Now, one day in about 1990, as I recall, Bowdoin was approached by a lobbying firm from Washington, K Street, the infamous K Street, offering to help the college gain federal financial support for any major projects that we might have then on the drawing boards. In other words, to help us get some pork out of Congress. Now, as it happens, there was in fact a new science building, and we were planning that, and it was in the design phase, so we took the bait. And we paid that lobbying firm a very hefty six-figure retainer. And in return, they produced a very big, glossy notebook that had a lot of pretty pictures of how our new science building would look. And they also got for us meetings with all 4 members of the congressional delegation from the state of Maine. And so we went off to Washington to meet our representatives and senators and to make the pitch for our hoped-for new science building. Now, the last person we met, this is 25 years ago, was Senator Mitchell, a meeting that remains etched in my memory. Our hopes were high. After all, the senator was one of our alumni, and he was at that time also the majority leader of the Senate. It was a perfect setup. And so, led by our college president at the time, Dr. Roy Greason, we laid out our arguments as to why the federal government should pay for Bowdoin College's new science building. The senator listened patiently, and then he spoke words that, to my mind, then as now, were the very essence of the man. He asked us if we were in his office that day, largely because of the lobbyist whom we had hired to gain access to him, and the answer to that was clearly yes. And then he asked if a new science building was truly the greatest need that the college had at that moment, and whether, in fact, federal funds were the only possible source of funding for the new building, and the answer to that, we admitted, was clearly no. Then he said that he was not going to support our request, but that he wished us well in our fundraising efforts. And as he ushered us out the door, he told us very kindly but firmly never to use a lobbyist again to get an appointment with him. But if we had a true need to see him and a legitimate concern, all we had to do was pick up the phone and call. How I wish that we had picked up the phone to call. But for me, that little episode speaks volumes for the senator's integrity, for his honesty and his forthrightness, and also for his gifts as a diplomatist. For all of us here today, we could do far worse than to model our own values, our behavior, our comportment after someone like Senator Mitchell. And it is no wonder that he holds the distinction of having been voted the most respected member of the Senate by a bipartisan group of senior congressional aides for 6 years in a row. Please join me in welcoming to the AUS podium the Honorable George J. Mitchell.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Hostetler, for that really very, indeed overly generous introduction. Thank all of you, ladies and gentlemen, for your presence, for permitting me to join with you today. Although he's not present, I want to express my gratitude to His Highness Sheikh Sultan for his gracious hospitality. We just had a very nice lunch. I want to also recognize a very dear friend of mine for many years, someone who is very much involved in this university, Hamid Jafar, who is here, a member of the board, and someone who I've known for many, many years, and he has constantly extolled the beauty and the benefits of a visit to Sharjah. And so this is my second visit. Hamid, it's very nice to see you again, and I'm glad your family and you are doing well. As a former Senate Majority Leader, I'm asked to speak often, and I do. And so I've heard myself talk so often that, for me, my remarks are not the high point of the day. For me, the high point of the day is the introduction. I have to say it was very nice. I'm grateful to you. But there is a danger in being introduced every day, sometimes twice a day, with these words, is that you start to believe the things that are said about you in the introductions. And so I always like to begin with a story that brings me back to earth. I spent 5 years in Northern Ireland, and I'll describe briefly my experience there in a few moments. And when I finished my work there, I returned to the United States. I wrote a book, and when the book was published, I set out on a tour of the country to promote sales of the book. I received very many invitations, indeed hundreds of them, and I learned then something I had not previously known. In the United States, there are more Irish-American organizations than there are Irish Americans. And every one of them asked me to come and speak. I couldn't go to all of them, but I went to many. And as I traveled around the country, attending these events, they developed an informal competition among my hosts as to who could give the longest, most ridiculous, often fantastic introduction. Really, it was, they went way too far. The proper response on my part would have been to demonstrate some humility, to ask them to shorten it, to save time, but I didn't have the proper reaction. I had a very bad reaction, and that was I encouraged them. One guy got up and took 35 minutes to introduce me. He described everything I'd done in my life, including many things that I myself had not previously been aware of. And when he finished, I chastised him for omitting that I had received the Science Award from my high school when I graduated. And it continued that way until I got to the last stop, which was in the state of Connecticut, the Stamford, Connecticut Irish American Society. When I entered the building, I was so impressed with myself, my head was so swollen that I could just barely squeeze into the front door. When I did, the first person I encountered was an elderly woman who rushed up to me, very nervous and excited, took both of my hands in hers, shook them vigorously, said she was so thrilled to meet me. She said, I don't live anywhere near here. She said, I drove 3.5 hours just to come here to shake your hand and tell you what a great man I think you are for all you've done in the world. Then she said, would you please do me a favor and sign your name to my poster? And she handed me what was the equivalent of a political poster with a big photograph on it. And I said, well, of course, I'll be happy to do so. I looked at it, and then I said to her, before I sign it, I think there's something I should tell you. She said, what is it? I said, I'm not Henry Kissinger. The poster was a portrait of Kissinger. She said, you're not? She said, well, who are you anyway? And when I told her, she was very upset. She said, well, that's terrible. She said, I came here to meet a great man named Kissinger, and all I've got is a nobody like you. I said, well, I'm sorry you feel so bad. I wish there's something I could do to make you feel better. She said, there is. I said, what is it? And she leaned forward, literally our foreheads were touching, and she said in kind of a conspiratorial whisper, "No one will ever know the difference." She said, "Would you mind signing Henry Kissinger's name to my portrait?" So I did. And I have been humble about these introductions since then. I'm going to speak a little bit later about my experience in Ireland, but I want to begin by referring to my first day there. It was about 18 years ago. It was my first visit ever. And in the morning, I met with a group from one community described as nationalists. They're predominantly Catholic. And in the afternoon, I met with the other community described as Unionists, who are predominantly Protestant. Although the meetings were held in buildings just a few yards apart, they were in two different worlds because they were separated by a huge wall which goes right through the capital city of Belfast, right through streets, and literally in some places right through buildings. Ironically, it's called the Peace Line, and it was erected to prevent the communities from engaging in the sectarian violence that had occurred there for so long and resulted in so many people being killed and permanently injured. It's a depressing sight, many places 30 or 40 feet high, topped by barbed wire, and it does effectively separate the two communities with some unfortunate results. Although they didn't engage in any prior dialogue, in fact, their whole history was one of conflict, I was surprised to learn that the presentations were very similar. Both sides stressed the importance of jobs and opportunity. And a Protestant minister, one of the most powerful and persuasive speakers I've ever heard, brought with him two maps, the first of which he placed up on the wall was titled Violence in the Urban Areas of Northern Ireland. And the second map, which he laid over the first one, was entitled Unemployment in the Urban Areas of Northern Ireland. And you will not be surprised to hear that they fit each other very closely. The conflict in Northern Ireland was not exclusively or even primarily economic. It involved, as conflicts do in the Middle East, in the Balkans, and in Asia and Africa, religious differences, differences in national identity, territorial disputes, and a whole host of other factors. Although one thing I've learned about conflict resolution is that each conflict, just like each human, is unique. No two are identical, and each must be resolved on its own terms with attention to the specific context and history of that conflict. There are some things in common. And one of the things in common, one of the things essential in all of them, is unemployment, lack of opportunity, lack of hope. As that minister put it to me persuasively, where men have no stake in a society, where they have no prospects in life, they are far more ready to take up arms and engage in violence to get their way. That does not explain all violence. It does not suggest that there are not many other factors in different circumstances. But it does lay bare the reality of which we all are aware, that despair is the fuel for instability anywhere it exists. No society is immune. No group of human beings can long succeed if a substantial or large portion of their society is not engaged does not have hope, does not have opportunity, does not have positive meaning in life. I enjoy visiting this area, as I have often. I served 2 tours of duty in my government's behalf in the region we know as the Middle East and North America. And I've found then and believe now that there is in this area great challenge and many opportunities. And I think that the effort to seize those opportunities and to meet those challenges must, here as elsewhere, begin with education. This great university, founded less than 20 years ago by His Highness, is, I think, helping to meet the challenges of the future in this region. And there are many. Let me begin with population. Between 1970 and 2010, the population of the Arab countries nearly tripled, from 128 to 360 million. It is now over 400 million, and according to the most recent projections by the United Nations, is expected to exceed 600 million by the year 2050. Over the past 50 years, the countries in this region experienced very large declines in infant mortality rates, something that we all applaud and enjoy. But the combination of low infant mortality rates and high fertility rates over the last several decades led to very high rates of population growth, which translates, of course, into a very large increase in the labor force. More and more people wanting and needing jobs and work. Currently, the population of this region is growing at nearly 2%, substantially higher than the world average. And one consequence of that is that the MENA region has the second youngest population among all of the regions of the world, behind only sub-Saharan Africa. The current number of young people, that is, men and women aged between 15 and 24 in this region, is unprecedented. Nearly 90 million in 2010. And half of the total population of this region is under the age of 25. And yet the prospects, while daunting, also remain good. Measured against other entities, the MENA nations represent the 4th largest concentration of population in the world, behind only China, India, and the European Union. They represent the 5th largest economy. The gross domestic product growth rate over the past decade is 5th among all regions, and the forecasted growth rate over the next several years is 3rd among all the regions of the world, second only to China and India. But with so many young people, youth unemployment stands at around 25%, which means that nearly 1 out of every 4 young persons in this region is not working and unable to find work. And that's double, more than double, the 10% unemployment rate for all adults around the world. That is, when measured against other areas, the youth unemployment rate here is 2.5 times higher than the world average. As a result, the region faces the daunting task of providing 85 million additional jobs in the next 10 years just to reduce the youth unemployment rate down to the world average of 10%. Now, these figures are even more daunting when you consider that the youth unemployment rate here exists despite the fact that young people in MENA have the lowest labor force participation. In other words, not all of the young people measured in the unemployment rates participate in the labor market and therefore aren't even included in those figures. So the real number is, without a doubt, higher. So the real challenge is to encourage investment, encourage growth, encourage opportunity. And that means, here as elsewhere, increasingly knowledge and skill. Every human society, here in the Emirates, in my own country, the United States, and in every other, has heartwarming stories of men and women who reached the pinnacle of success in life in their chosen fields with little or no education. But we all know that's a thing of the past. It will be increasingly difficult in the 21st century and beyond, no matter where one lives and works, to achieve success in any field, let alone to reach the pinnacle of success without ever higher levels of knowledge and skill. Now, we can't teach wisdom as we teach knowledge and skills. And increasingly, wisdom will be called upon, but there will have to be the foundation of knowledge for anyone to even achieve a level of wisdom. It is a problem that I said exists everywhere, not just here. Right now, there are 7 billion people on Earth. The UN projection, to which I earlier referred, estimates that by the year 2050, there will be 9.6 billion. Think about that. The number of the increase is almost equal to the total population of the world just a few decades ago. This will not be an easy challenge to meet. And it is really up to you young people, those here, whose lives will be lived almost entirely in the 21st century, to meet those challenges. And the first requirement, beyond knowledge, is some degree of stability, prosperity, and opportunity. I want to describe briefly my experience in Northern Ireland as a way of demonstrating what I think is the correlation between stability and prosperity. The fact of the matter is that in no society can there be opportunity and economic growth in a climate of violence, of fear, and of hostility. Business people like Hamid Jafar and the many others here don't want to invest where they don't know what's going to happen the next day, the next week, or the next month. When I first went to Northern Ireland, my views had been shaped by watching American television, which of course focused almost entirely on controversial acts of violence. The mental picture that most Americans had was of a bomb exploding, of a truck burning, of a riot occurring. Of course, those events did occur, but when you get to a place, actually, there's a normal life that goes on for most people. But that life is diminished and shrunken by the fear and anxiety that hangs over conflict-torn societies. So when I first went there, I encountered a situation in which there had been a long and very hostile relationship between Britain and Ireland following Ireland's independence from Britain after nearly 800 years of domination. But by the close of the 20th century, as the violence mounted, as the deaths mounted, as the number of persons seriously maimed mounted, the two governments decided that if there was to be any hope of ending the conflict there, they had to cooperate to try to create a process in which serious negotiations could take place. And after many years of effort, they finally were able to get negotiations underway in 1996. The prime ministers of both countries asked me to serve as chairman of those talks. I had been in the country for over a year, working to encourage investment and trade there. And so I began naively expecting it to take a few weeks or months, and I ended up 5 years involved in negotiations, the longest and most difficult I've ever been engaged in. After about a year and a half in which there was no progress, just a total stalemate, we encountered an especially bleak and dangerous time. A prominent Protestant military leader was assassinated in prison by a group of Catholic prisoners, and that touched off a series of retaliatory assassinations and bombings that threatened to engulf the entire society and return them back to the intense conflict that had previously existed. On a long flight from Ireland back to the United States, I devised a plan to establish an early and unbreakable deadline where the talks would be brought to a conclusion one way or the other. The existence of a deadline didn't guarantee success, but I thought the absence of a deadline guaranteed failure, and a deadline meant that we at least had a chance. I recommended a final deadline of midnight on a Thursday, the beginning of Easter weekend, which, for those of you familiar with Irish history, know is an important and emotional time in Irish history. And we spent 2 weeks in direct, round-the-clock negotiations. And an agreement finally was reached on a Friday known as Good Friday, which was in every sense a compromise. In the interests of peace and stability, both sides accepted provisions that they had for years denied that they would ever accept. Both sides gave up things that were critical to their communities in the interest of the one thing that benefited all communities, and that is peace and stability. And since then, they've kept the peace. They're not killing each other now. They're working together, although it remains a segregated society. Attitudes of hate and hostility and fear take a long time to abate. But in the end, they will keep the peace so long as they have opportunity and hope for the people there. And the greatest thing that we can do to resolve conflict anywhere is to encourage leaders to be flexible, to be willing to compromise, to be willing to take risks for peace, as so many are willing to take risks in time of conflict. I believe from my experience there and elsewhere that there's no such thing as a conflict that can't be ended. They're created, they're conducted, they're sustained by human beings. They can be ended by human beings when they come to believe that their best interest lies in peace. And I believe that will occur in this region as it did there, as it did in South Africa, as it has done in so many other places. And for that, we all must hope and pray for stability, opportunity, and prosperity. Thank you very much for having me and for your attention, and I'll be glad now to take any questions anyone might have. Thank you. In fact, if anyone doesn't have a question but would like to give a speech, I'll be glad to hear that as well.
We do have microphones. If you have a question, please raise your hand and we'll make sure you get a microphone. Right down here. Hello?
Yeah. Senator Mitchell, it's a great honor. It's a great honor, sir, to talk to you. My question is that in Ireland, obviously you succeeded. You have also been associated with the Middle East peace process. What has stopped achieving success here? Thank you.
What are the problems in the peace process here?
Kept peace from breaking out in the Middle East.
Yeah, yeah. When I was in Northern Ireland, I thought it was very complicated and difficult. But I remember I gave a speech in Jerusalem a couple of years after I left Northern Ireland. And in the question-answer period, I made the comment I referred to earlier that the peace agreement in Northern Ireland was reached almost exactly 800 years after the British domination of Ireland began. And when I finished the speech, as I left, a group of people gathered around me, as frequently happens, want to ask more questions, want to criticize me. And one elderly gentleman said, he was hard of hearing, he had a hearing aid, so he kind of yelled out, "Senator Mitchell, did you say 800 years? I said, yes, 800 years. And he repeated the number, and I repeated the number. And he said, 800 years. Such a recent argument. No wonder you settled it. Only in the Middle East could 800 years be considered a recent argument. So it's more complicated. It's more difficult. It goes back further. The hostilities are deeper. And there are many complex factors that didn't exist in Northern Ireland. But underlying it is, I believe, the same principle that applies elsewhere. When the parties become persuaded, both sides, that it is in their self-interest, they will reach agreement. They haven't gotten to that point yet, and I confess to you, I tried very hard to persuade both sides that it was in their self-interest. Both, I spent many, many hours with Prime Minister Netanyahu, with President Abbas, and before President Abbas on my first tour of duty with then Chairman Arafat. And while they all say they want peace, and I believe they do, but they want it on terms that the other side can't accept. And there will come a time, I think, when both are prepared to take the painful steps necessary to achieve it. It will be politically difficult on both sides because both societies are divided. There is a very strong and vocal opposition in both societies. But I believe that the risks facing both from the failure to enter an agreement are substantially greater than the risks they will take to get an agreement. And sooner or later, that's going to become obvious to whoever the leaders are in those societies. And when they do, it's our task and our responsibility to encourage and support and assist them in that effort.
How you see, please, the future of Jerusalem? Future of Jerusalem.
I'm having a hard time.
How do you see the future of Jerusalem?
Oh, yes.
And Israel.
Yes, yeah. In the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, there are no easy issues. Everyone is difficult, everyone is fiercely contested, and everyone carries with it great emotion and grounded in a long history. None of them exceed Jerusalem in that respect. It is, without a doubt, the most difficult issue, the most emotional on both sides. It will be a particular challenge because on the Palestinian side, there is largely a sense that the issues of borders and water and populations are essentially Palestinian issues to be resolved by themselves. But with respect to Jerusalem, that is an issue to Muslims worldwide. And the Palestinians don't have a free hand to do whatever they want with respect to Jerusalem. They must and will and should respect the views of people in other countries. So it essentially isn't a negotiation between Israel and Palestinians on Jerusalem. It's a much broader negotiation, embracing many, many different regimes and many, many different views, and therefore it will be more difficult to achieve. But I also do believe that it can be resolved in a manner that will be acceptable to both. I When I was in office, I received so many volunteer suggestions. I had a whole room full of maps with people had drawn and sent to me their proposed solution, first for the borders between Palestine and Israel, and secondly for what to do about Jerusalem. And I sincerely believe that out of all of this there can come a solution that both sides find acceptable, although not their very first choice, so long as there is a willingness to reach a compromise. And that means not ignoring the central objectives of your opponent. And the best argument to be made for it is that it's in both their self-interest. Just before he left office in 2009, President Bush traveled to Jerusalem. And he stood in Jerusalem and made a speech in which he summarized American policy toward the conflict. And let me read you now just a few sentences of what he said, which has special significance for the question you raised. I'm now quoting President George W. Bush, January 2009, in Jerusalem. The point of departure for permanent status negotiations is clear. There should be an end to the occupation that began in 1967. The agreement must establish Palestine as a homeland for the Palestinian people, just as Israel is a homeland for the Jewish people. The negotiations must ensure that Israel has secure, recognized, and defensible borders. And they must ensure that the state of Palestine is viable, contiguous, sovereign, and independent. It is vital that each side understands that satisfying the other's fundamental objective is a key to a successful agreement. Security for Israel and viability for the Palestinian state are in the mutual interest of both parties. Now, that's the end of the quotation. And what he said essentially is that the Israelis have a state. They don't have security, and they're entitled to it. The Palestinians don't have a state, and they are entitled to have their state. Israel cannot, in my judgment, attain security until the Palestinians get a state, and the Palestinians cannot attain a state until the Israelis have a reasonable and defensible sense of security and borders. So I think the point, that was the President's statement of policy. President Obama has essentially reaffirmed that policy. It has been American policy now for some time, and what it basically says to both sides, if you want to get what you want, you have to make sure the other side gets what they want, so that your interests are bound up together. That's the principle, I think, that is widely acknowledged, but unfortunately has not yet been able to be implemented because of substantial differences on issues in the absence of trust, the high level of hostility, and many other factors.
Question up here.
You choose the question.
Another couple of questions. And then you.
Good afternoon, sir. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to come to AUS and give us this talk. With your experiences in the US Senate in mind, would you mind enlightening us about the power of lobbying in the US Senate and Congress right now, and whether you think money and lobbying interests have the power to drown out the voice of the American people and the American interests?
Yeah. Did you say any lobbying, you mean?
Well, lobbying like the Israeli lobby.
Okay. That's what I thought you meant. You didn't say it. Yeah.
Or perhaps the military-industrial lobby.
Yeah. The American political process is wide open. First, let's be clear. In all of human history, is anyone here aware of any government in which organization and money did not play a role. Nobody. It's a fact of life. In every society, in all of human history, the capacity to organize is a mechanism for gaining power, and money is a mechanism for gaining the capacity to organize. In that respect, the United States is no different from any other place in the world. What we are different at is that it's a completely wide open process, open to anyone, regardless of background. My mother was an immigrant from Lebanon. My father was the orphan son of Irish immigrants. My mother couldn't read or write. My father never went to school. And I became the majority leader of the United States Senate. So you have to understand it is a wide open system. Given the long history through which the Jewish people have gone, they have an understandable desire to organize in a manner that they believe protects their interests. And they have done so in the United States very effectively. And I, myself of Lebanese heritage, speak with Lebanese and Arabic groups in the United States all the time. And what I tell them is, don't complain, go out and do the same thing. The fact of the matter is, it is not just members of the American Jewish community organized. When the United States entered into a nuclear agreement with India, which required ratification in the US Senate, there must have been 500 lobbyists on Capitol Hill paid for by Americans of Indian heritage and business groups wanting that passed. When the United States was called upon to endorse countries like Poland and Czechoslovakia entering the European Union and joining NATO, we were flooded with people who came in, lobbyists for one side or another, asking in behalf of those countries that, and the people in the United States of that heritage, that we vote for them. Tom mentioned at the beginning, even Tiny Bowdoin College in Brunswick, Maine, hired a lobbyist and paid a lot of money, unnecessarily in their case. So it's a wide open process. And the way to deal with it is to organize and participate in the process and compete effectively on the terms which exist. One of the real negatives of the American political system is the vast sums of money that are spent in the process of campaigning and lobbying. I happen not to agree with it. When I was in the Senate, I was a principal author of a law which would have restrained campaign financing. Unfortunately, the first President Bush didn't agree with it. We passed the law and he vetoed it. We've not been able to change the law since, and actually since then there have been decisions that have opened the gates even further. So billions of dollars are being spent. So an American individual or political group has a choice to try to change the system and, to the extent possible, participate in it. And what I have to tell you frankly, that the groups from the Middle East don't participate effectively. I'll tell you a story. This is a true story. I've told it often in the United States. When I was Senate Majority Leader, we had a vote coming up on a Middle Eastern issue. And I was deluged with hundreds of requests from groups to meet with me. And I said, okay, I'll set aside 1 hour the day before the vote. First half hour, let the Jewish community representatives come in. Second half hour, let the Arab community's representatives come in. The first group came in, 4 men, sat down. I put out a rule, no more than 8 people, because that's the size of my conference room. I said, all right, you got a half hour, make your case. One guy spoke for 10 minutes. He said, we got 4 points. He identified the points. Then he handed me a sheet of paper, 1 through 4. He said, that's our position. I said, well, you guys got 20 more minutes. Anybody else want to speak? No, we agree with him. They left. 20 minutes later, in come 8 Arab Americans. I said, I said, you guys got a half hour? Who wants to speak? 8 guys raised their hands. So I said to the guy sitting next to me, you start. He opened his mouth. He said 2 sentences. The guy on the other side of the table said, no, no, no. You're wrong. I don't agree with that. They spent 30 minutes arguing among themselves. When the 30 minutes was up, I said, let me tell you guys what happened in the half hour before you came. I said, I don't know what you want because you don't know what you want. But the guys who preceded you know what they want, and I'm in no doubt about their position. What I'm telling you is that in order to participate in the political process anywhere, this is not just the United States, you could take any country. I understand that there are students here from 90 countries, and in whatever countries there are that hold elections, there is a process of organization and financing that exists on some scale or level. And to be effective, you have to organize, and it means both raising money and developing a coherent message that can be delivered simply and persuasively. And I don't think the answer is to single out one group and say, you've been so successful, you can no longer participate. It's to tell every group, you get out and participate, and you do the job, and you get your message across. That's the only way it's going to work in the United States. Until, or at the same time, I should say, I really do believe that we should change our system and reduce the influence of money and lobbying in politics. But I have to tell you frankly, there does not appear to be much likelihood of that occurring because the Republicans are virtually unanimous in their opposition to changes in the campaign reform system, and I don't think it can be enacted over that opposition.
One last question.
Good afternoon, Senator. Senator, on the issue of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, you talked about how compromises were necessary. But don't you think that the compromises that the Western world or that America asks of the Palestinians is more than they ask of Israel, and it's unfair on the Palestinians, in terms of land, for example?
No, I don't think so. First, let me say that the United States does strongly support the creation of a Palestinian state. It strongly supports the Palestinian people. The largest source of assistance for Palestinians in recent years has been the United States in terms of funding for humanitarian and all other needs. Close second is the European Union. But our view is that the decision should be made by the parties themselves, that they should sit in a negotiation in which we would participate and provide assistance and support, but it is not up to us to make demands of one side or another to tell them what to do, although that's what both sides want. I was repeatedly asked by Arab officials when I was envoy that would I sponsor a cutoff of all financial assistance to Israel because that would force the Israelis to do what we wanted. And correspondingly, I was asked frequently by Israeli officials, would I help cut off all assistance to Palestinians, and then we could force the Palestinians what to do. My answer is I don't think that tactic will work either way. I think it will have a reverse effect either way. And that I did not think in a circumstance in which we supported the aspirations of both sides, the aspirations of Israel for secure, defensible borders, the aspirations of Palestinians for a state, that we should be in the business of, in effect, denying assistance to either. So every individual can make his own judgment. I recognize that there are many, possibly in this room, throughout this region, who disagree with American policy in that respect. I just simply say that from my view, the policy is the correct one. We support a state for the Palestinians. We support security for the Israelis because we believe that it is the right and just thing to do for both, and that neither can attain its objective by denying to the other side its objective. Thank you all very much. It's a real pleasure to be here.